This is the In the Rabbit Hole episode archive project. What you're about to watch and listen to is a past episode from In the Rabbit Hole Urban Survival Podcast. You can learn more by visiting intherabbithole.com. Be sure to like this video and subscribe to our YouTube channel now.
Here's two guys that survived a break-in from the Kool-Aid Man, Aaron and Jonathan.
Howdy, and welcome to episode 70 of In the Rabbit Hole's Urban Survival Podcast. In today's episode, we introduce ourselves to new listeners, give thoughts on being new to preparedness, and answer the burning question, what do jumbo shrimp have to do with survival? We are your hosts, Aaron
and Jonathan.
And you are in the rabbit hole, safe and sound. Today's show is sponsored by Cat's Coffee. If you're looking for truly exceptional coffee to help you survive the morning or the next zombie apocalypse, you need to be drinking Cat's. They specialize in the finest coffee from sources that prioritize environmental responsibility and are fair trade certified. Their goal is to achieve perfection in every cup. Check them out at Cat's, K-A-T-Z as in zebra, coffee.com, or click on their bright green banner on the site and make sure you're dealing with an official sponsor of the show. Again, that's Cat's, K-A-T-Z as in zebra, coffee.com. For today's show, we are going to focus on a couple of things. One, people that are new to prep, and two, people that are new to the show. We're going to start off with the basics. What is the rabbit hole, and what is it all about? The rabbit hole itself, the mission, as we've kind of laid it out for ourselves internally, is to deliver useful, level-headed information on survival in a way that also improves your life today and prepares you for the tough times or even extreme times of tomorrow.
And of course, to increase the listener base to all of our, ramblings and rantings that we used to have in a Tahoe.
Of course. Because if it's just the two of us, we can only talk to each other so much.
Exactly. And at some point you question whether or not you're still sane.
I question that every minute of every day. As a matter of fact, we were just talking about that before the show. And I think the answer was we are certainly not sane.
No, not at all.
No. But so how do we even go about doing what we talked about before? There's certainly several other survival shows and some of them are really good. What's the purpose of doing our own show and doing an urban survival show? And I think that is the key, was nobody else was really talking about urban survival. And let's face it, we've reached a point in society, our current society, where the majority of people are living in urban environments. And there's definitely an argument to be made for living in a rural environment, whether we're talking in a context of survival or talking in a context of quality of life. If it's what you want and it's what you enjoy, then by all means you should do it. But for us, the idea of survival itself being the sole driving force of moving out to a rural area, if it's not something you're going to enjoy, would be pointless.
Right. And we are not in any way, I think the point of what we're saying here, to kind of get to it is, if that's something that works for you and you have the financial wherewithal to do that, go for it. I am all for it. To be honest with you, I would love to have a property outside the city as well as my job keeps me in this city, and in order for me to maintain the financial wherewithal to have the property outside the city, I would also need something inside the city, because I'm not willing to put up with the 2-hour plus commutes required otherwise. But if you can do it, go for it. I know people who are capable of working from home. They can truly work from anywhere. One of the gentlemen who works at the company that I work at, he's a developer. He's out in a very rural part of, I believe, New Hampshire. He has something like 140 acres. He makes his own maple syrup. He was talking about clearing the back 40 recently, and the tractor broke 20 acres in. If you're capable of doing all that stuff and you can truly work from anywhere, sure, go for it. We don't see anything wrong with that, and we don't knock that way of living. We just say that urban living for us is the way we actually like to live. It's more than just the job. I'm going to be honest. I like living in the city. I like having access to the restaurants. I like the community aspect of living in the urban areas that I live in. So we wanted to produce a show for people like us, people who had a like-minded thought about how all of it was going and how they needed to prepare, and not just preparing for the end of the world stuff.
The end of the world stuff is something that having that conversation is something that we're going to come to at the very end of the show. But to add on to other things about an urban environment, if you are, we can call it one or two things. If you are in a niche belief structure or religion or culture background of some kind, or it's often referred to as a minority, then an urban environment with a larger population offers you more diversity, and that may mean you having access to things that in a rural environment where you've got one place of worship that has one belief structure, then that's not going to fit you if that is something that is important in your life.
Right.
So let's say in small town America, we can kind of easily say that it's going to be a Christian background and a Christian small town culture.
And to be honest, even depending where you are in small town America, which sect of Christianity is going to be different as well. I mean, if you're in the South, you're going to find one. If you're going to be in the Midwest, you might find another. In the Northeast, you'll find different ones. So even that changes.
Exactly. And, in the same thing, whether we're talking about Judaism or Buddhism or Islam or whatever faith structure or philosophical structure, depending on how you look at it, is in play. So there are some people where that is a big enough part of their life that it's, if I leave the city that I'm in, I do not have that community. I don't have that community to teach my children. I don't have that community for myself to engage in. And that's a very big part for a lot of people. A big part of their lives is what faith they are.
Right.
So that's kind of another one that comes into play, aside from all the more material amenities of an urban environment. So, but for us to do a show, we have to be able to point out the problems, and we have to be able to offer solutions. And for us, that also means sometimes asking open-ended questions.
Right, because a lot of times what's right for me may not be right for you. And that's okay. There's not anything wrong with those things.
And we've made that a big part of the show. And at least we've really been working towards making that a big part of a show. And we've kind of been honing this a lot more so lately, of asking questions, not just for ourselves, but presenting the questions for you to ask about your own life. Because I really don't believe, and I'm going to say because I'm not going to speak for Jonathan in this case, that there is no perfect solution for everything and for everyone. Everyone has their own individual needs.
Yeah, and I wouldn't be doing the show with Yaron if I didn't agree with that. I think everyone's got their own individual needs, and everybody has, it's not even just the major needs, because we all have the same big needs. We all need to eat, we all need a roof, we all need water, air, all those kinds of things. And we'll get into some of those later. But it's how you define the details of those things. What are my needs when it comes to shelter may be different than somebody else's. And it may not even be always needs. Sometimes it's also wants. And wants have to be considered as well.
A lot of the shows that we found, and if it's something that interests you and it's your prerogative, it's not something that we're going to, not really something that we're going to beat up on. If really focusing on the dramatic and the scary is of interest to you, I certainly understand that, and I appreciate it.
I'll boil it down into this statement. We didn't want to be the hellfire and brimstone of survivalism.
No. We were looking for more calm and peaceful, not necessarily in a hippie way, but more in just how do we make this productive and how do we make this positive without focusing on those things.
You used good word for it when you wrote up the show notes, but it's how to motivational preparedness and survival versus fire and brimstone preparedness and survival.
So we don't usually get into the topics, and I think based on the reviews we've got and the emails we've got and the conversations I've had on the forum, This is what has attracted a lot of people to the show, is the fact that we don't bother getting into that stuff with and pointing out the realization that pretty much 80% of the preps you're going to do are going to cover everything that we're going to experience in our lives, most likely. And
Yep.
we'll get into that in a second, but it really is. It's about how do we come out and motivate people that are already motivated and interested in the topic to take further steps towards preparedness and maybe offer some new perspectives and again, some questions to ask themselves about preparedness without scaring the crap out of you.
Yeah, and honestly, we do it for partially, and I'm going to admit this, Aaron, you may or may not think this, so I'm only going to speak for myself. It's partially selfish reasons, too. The more of you out there that are motivated to prepare for disaster and prepare for all the bad things, the less I have to worry about you not being prepared.
I would 100% agree with that.
I want all my neighbors to be somewhat prepared because at the end of the day, if I have a community of prepared folks around me, then my chances of getting through things, whatever it is always better. And then their chances are always better too. So I don't have to worry myself because, at the end of the day, I think we all, whether we know our neighbors really well or not, we all want our neighbors to do well. Unless you've got that neighbor that's just so annoying, you want him to move out. But beyond that, we all want our neighbors to do well. We all want our friends to do well, and so we consider all of you, all the listeners out there, friends of a kind, and we'd like all of you to do well too. So it's that whole idea of motivating to do these things and to focus on, things we've talked about, things like survival chi, things like the high impact scenarios and the basics so that you'll make it through anything that might get thrown at you.
Exactly. Go back to not scaring the crap out of the people. There are quite a few shows that we've really wanted to do. They've been stewing on the back burner, so to speak, for quite a while because it always comes down to how do we talk about this topic without it being doom and gloom, without it being fire and brimstone. How can we talk about something that is very serious and there is a chance it could happen? How do we talk about that in a rational way without screaming into the microphones or something like that? And so those shows do often and have for a while now sat on the back burner while they get massaged and figured out. And how do we talk about this in a rational way without it being purely about fear?
Well, and just to add to that, we also try, and we've had our moments. There have been and not too many, but a couple of shows. But we try to stay calm and even keel. We try not to get too angry about anything. We don't. The goal is never to accuse you, the listeners, of anything. We don't think you guys are doing the wrong things, but sometimes we get passionate nonetheless. And if we, when we do get a little preachy, we tend to recognize it after the fact, and we still release the show because we think it's probably, you guys probably understand it too. Every one of you probably goes through that with your friends, your neighbors, your loved ones. It happens, but at the end of the day, we really try to keep the show focused, and you all have heard it, on being calm, even keel, and just trying to provoke thinking.
Exactly. And that's also, along those same lines, why the show has, by and large, with the exception of one episode, stayed away from politics, even though we do on a regular basis remind everybody we are libertarians. We're pretty ardent libertarians, and so the reason we do that is so that you have an understanding of our perspective when we're talking about something.
Right. That we find that allows you to make judgments too, because whenever you hear something, when I do it, at least, I put judgments around it. I put parameters around it. I understand the perspective, or try to understand the perspective of the speaker. And I think by filling you in with that information, it allows you to understand our perspective, and then better either assimilate or, if you need to, toss out whatever information that it is we're saying.
And that, I mean, if we're saying something that doesn't jive with your political beliefs, hopefully you listen to the rest of the good information and don't throw away the whatever. And also, hopefully, maybe you take a few moments to consider what we've said. And that's in the future. For instance, in the future, we've got a show sitting on the back burner that is, what is liberty and how is liberty affected? And how does liberty and survival, how do they coexist with each other? What is their relationship? But that's a tough show to do because liberty, as being libertarians, liberty is going to be a very passionate show for Jonathan and I. So what we've had to do is we've slowly been working on it of how do we do that show without screaming about it.
Right. And that we don't ever want to yell at you. That's not the idea here. We don't want to yell at the listeners. We don't want to yell at anybody. I mean, we really want to have a thought. Well, sometimes we want to yell at people, but other times we want to have a thought-provoking conversation.
Exactly. Most of the time, we're trying to have a thought-provoking conversation. So, but to move on to some of the things that we talked about earlier, well, if we're going to talk about survival in a practical sense and in a way that helps our lives in the here and now, as well as if we're talking about more dramatic things, well, one of the things that we found out in the community is a really great concept that was developed by Jack Spirko of the Survival Podcast, and we've shortened it down into just calling it the disaster matrix, and I believe he calls it the disaster probability matrix. And the short version of that is that there is an inverse relationship between the likelihood of something and its impact on you as an individual. And we can take that both ends of those spectrums and apply them to beyond just you as an individual. We can apply that to a community and far out from there. But what does that mean? An inverse relationship. It means that they're opposites, basically. So we can take survival from a practical day-to-day standpoint of if you're storing food, that helps you in the here and now if you have a personal disaster, which is the most likely thing to happen in your life. And the recent goings on with the economy for the last few years is a good example of that. We've had a lot of high unemployment throughout the globe and a lot of issues going on. So in storing food, while that is a survival topic, that's also a personal disaster mitigation byproduct.
Right. Or even, we focus on some of the simple things like paying down debt,
Yes.
keeping your finances in order. That goes just towards the most basic things of even just if you think about survival as living well, then paying off your debt, putting a little money aside, making sure your finances are in order, all that just goes even towards this most simple thing of living well. But as Aaron said, you think about how things might happen to you. A loved one passing is much more likely to happen than the black swan event. If that does happen, you may need a little extra money set aside to take days off, to be able to travel to a funeral, to just make sure that you can do what needs to be done in order to support yourself, your family, whatever needs to be done there. So it doesn't even have to be as extreme as losing a job. It can be a normal thing that happens to people every day as a loved one passes. Although these days losing a job is something that happens pretty regularly.
Yeah. And to go out from the personal, we can start, and this is how we plan and how we look at things within the context of this show, is that as we go further out in the idea of as something becomes a broader, higher impact topic. So let's take it from the personal, death in the family, job loss, medical issues, anything like that, and we take it out to a more community issue. So if a city or something is experiencing a drought, or I think where is it in? I think it's Tombstone that they had some kind of weather issue recently happen where most of their water lines into the city from their wells broke, and then they're having issues with the government getting it fixed, which is maybe something we'll scream about in Liberty.
Oh, even down here in Texas already, cities are starting to declare just in preparation for a hot, dry summer again. For instance, the city of San Marcos has already declared a water emergency.
Oh, have they really? I didn't know that.
Yep. Yeah.
And they've got a big river running through their town.
You'd think, but yeah, they're still be. I guess what happened is their aquifers are running about 2 feet low.
Oh wow.
Because they don't actually get their drinking water from those rivers. Now, obviously, if you had to, you could.
Yeah.
You need to purify and things like that. But their city aquifers are very low. Still from last year. So even to that level of the community, or even stepping it up to a natural disaster within that community.
And then we can go out from communities and we were just talking about natural disasters. We can talk about a hurricane. A hurricane can affect an entire state. Certainly saw that with Katrina. And here on the Gulf Coast, we see that all the time affect either big portions of a state or whole state altogether.
And for those of you who didn't notice recently, and I forget opinions about it or not, Homeland Security, you can have any opinion you want, but they recently came out with a few warnings this year about hurricane season, pointing out that resources are limited federal resources are limited. So this goes back to a lot of what we talked about with the CERT classes. But resources out there are limited, and know that you do need to be prepared for hurricanes. That was actually the recent statement by Janet Napolitano.
And I'll throw it in real quick as long as we're talking about hurricanes that a couple days ago, June 1st, I believe it was June 1st, was the beginning of hurricane season. And
Yes.
we'll throw a link in the show notes today about hurricane preparedness for anybody that hasn't heard the show before and is interested in more information on the topic. But getting back to new to prep and or new to the show, the other thing that we choose to focus on, because after looking at the disaster matrix and seeing that the higher impact we have, it becomes lower probability, the wider spread. So if we're talking about an asteroid hitting the Earth being the largest of impacts where the whole Earth is just thrown off kilter and destroyed, well, that's a very high impact event, very low likelihood. So there we have the finale of the inverse relationship, so to speak, as far as within this quick rundown we're going to give it.
Yes. So yeah, it all goes down to the further it touches you personally, directly, daily, the further it goes from that. Although, an asteroid hitting you would probably touch you pretty personally. Although you wouldn't be the one worried about it anymore. But the further you get away from your personal state, the less likely things are to happen, actually. But it actually goes towards a pretty universal rule, which I assume is what you're going to touch on next.
Yeah.
But that pretty universal rule of the 80-20 rule. It's kind of how the world works. Basically, 80% of anything is covered, and the 20% basically isn't. But you only really need the 80% for most things. And that's kind of how that rule works. And I think it's pretty true for just about everything. I don't know, Aaron. I don't know if you can think of anything that the 80-20 rule doesn't work in. But
there's only one time that I'm aware of that the 80-20 rule is flipped, and that is the concept that happens a lot of times in business. That is, 20% of people do 80% of the work.
Yeah,
that's
probably a true statement.
But that's the only time I know that rule is flipped. The rest of the time, it's focus on the 80%, and the 20% is...
And it's mostly around needs.
Yeah.
Usually think of the 80-20 rule, it's usually around needs. It can focus on other things, too.
And so the way that relates to survival in this show is if we get 80% of our needs taken care of through focusing on the basics of survival, rather than worrying about the truly dramatic, unlikely thing, if we can get that 80% there, then we are quite literally 80% of the way to being prepared for the dramatic things that are difficult to prepare for, the large-scale impact on.
Right. If you cover 80% of your needs in general, then you're usually 100% covered, except for the 20% of the time when you're only 80% covered.
So we said the basics. What are the basics? Well, the survival basics are just that. And they don't... I think everybody in the community kind of adds stuff to it here and there from time to time, but they don't usually change very much. And it's kind of like 6 things. You've got air, using the rule of threes. You've got air, and you've got 3 minutes without air.
And don't write us telling us about how you can hold your breath longer.
No, just post videos of that. So anyway, so we've got 3 minutes without air. Well, air is something in general most of us have the good sense to keep breathing and figure out how to keep giving ourselves air. But there are instances where in a survival situation, if we want to talk about the dramatic stuff, that air does become a concern. I'm going to go into that now because this is a basic show. And then we move on from there to shelter and energy. Energy usually being referred to as fire, but energy can mean the energy to do work, the energy to keep yourself warm, the energy to keep yourself cool, and the shelter starting with the clothing on your body. This is without those things. In most instances, you've got about 3 hours that's how long you're good for before you overheat or hypothermia sets in, unless you're happen to be in a very good climate that is a really nice temperature all the freaking time.
Well, but we had to have a 3 on there. So, I mean, overall, though, that's probably a little bit more flexible.
Yeah. Well, and again, these are, except for air, Well, even air. I mean, we just talked
No,
about
no,
there are people.
air's pretty fixed. Water's pretty fixed. Food's pretty fixed. But I mean,
Well, but even these. I
yeah,
mean, we can talk about that. These are general rules.
right.
That there are nuances with this. There are people that can hold their breath for 20 minutes.
Right, and there are some people that retain water better than others. I
Exactly.
mean, there's always going to be something in there. And by the way, the next one on the list, of course, is water.
Yes.
And you get about 3 days before serious dehydration will take over and usually end you at that point.
Mm-hmm. And then the next priority would be food, and that you get about 3 weeks.
Yeah, and food actually, that's one of the reasons that a lot of the hardcore survivalists will tell you the first thing you look for is shelter and water. And then after that, you worry about food because you've got some time for food.
Yeah. You may not be comfortable, but you're
Right.
not going to die without it.
Yeah, and you will become, to keep this in mind, without food, you become lethargic. Your body does start shutting down. But most of us, especially those of us, in urban areas who are Americans and maybe a little less fit, you've got at least 3 weeks.
Maybe more for some of us. So to go past food, there's companionship. And Ron Hood states this as love, and that you can go only 3 months without love. And so we've changed that to companionship for today so that people don't get hung up on the lustful love or the butterflies in your stomach love. This is more just human companionship and interaction and caring about one another.
Right. And this goes to that whole, we've said it many times, you're not going to be a lone wolf. You're not going to be that hermit, especially if you are someone who enjoys living in an urban environment. Going more than 3 months without human contact is really where this companionship comes in. Speaking with somebody, having somebody who can talk to you longer than that, and you'll start really impacting your ability to maintain mental health, which will impact physical health too.
Yes, exactly. But an interesting thing about companionship, if you're interested in survival, you've probably at some point checked out the different survival TV shows that are out there. And a personal favorite of mine, and I think it's Jonathan's personal favorite too, is Les Stroud's.
Yep.
What is it? What does he call his show? I just blanked out.
Survival Man?
Survival Man.
Or Survivor Man.
Survivor Man. And what you often notice in his shows is at some point, is what he usually goes out for about 7 days, isn't it?
Yep.
And at some point around day 4 or 5, he'll start talking about how lonely he is. And I don't think that that's that unusual.
No, he almost always does that. And he always references his family
Mm-hmm.
in a very intentional way.
Yeah.
You can almost tell that he's bringing it up, not so much for you, the listener or the viewer, but more for himself.
And to go on to the 6th, security. And security, I don't know, this is debatable. Security I don't know that it has a time limit on it because it's very contextual sensitive.
Yeah, and it totally wraps the others. I don't even know if calling it number 6 is the right way to go, but you got to put some order to things.
Exactly.
But it's almost like a wrapper that goes around the whole basics package.
Because without security, if you don't have security of mind, you're going to drive yourself kind of crazy. Just like with companionship, you start to become lonely. Before you know it, you're talking to a volleyball on a desert island somewhere. But so
I love my volleyball.
So we have to. I don't remember the name of that volleyball, but Wilson. Yes, it popped in my head, of course, just as you said it. But so there's security of mind that we have to have this sense of being secure in our surroundings. We have to know that we have access to water. We have to know that we have access to food and air and shelter and energy so that we have a calmness about us. And then we also have to have security in our person. We have to, going back to the mind for a second, we have to know that we are secure in our persons, that we can defend ourselves from whether we're talking about the environment around us or whether we're talking about people or whether we're talking about wild animals. That has to be present in our minds that we have that ability, but we also have to actually have that ability. It cannot be a facade.
Right. And it does, by the way, having that security is the security to protect your shelter and energy, the security to protect your water, your food, your potential companions. That's all part of that as well. That's why I say it's kind of the neat little wrapper that you get to put all of this inside of.
And so to go past that, where we get into more of the concepts that Jonathan and I have really developed for the show, which is how do we decide what to focus on beyond the basics? Because if we were simply focusing on that survival means you have to have air, shelter, energy, water, food, companionship, and security.
That's one show.
That's it. We're done. We're finished. Forget it. Well, I mean, we could make that we could probably we can babble enough. We could stretch that out into like a dozen shows.
Oh yeah, no, we could totally do a show for each one, or maybe even like a couple for each one. But I think you all would get really bored very quickly.
I think we get bored doing it very quickly,
and probably stop listening. So we actually spent a lot of time, and I joked about the Tahoe, but the reality is we actually did. We would regularly. One of the things Aaron and I did when I was in Houston is we would almost every single Sunday go shooting. So it was a good time to go. Very few people out there. Going in the morning and really spend some time. And on the ride there and back, we would talk about all this stuff. Just maybe not in the level of detail we do in the show, or at least not. Let me rephrase that to the level of
intelligence.
Well, it just wasn't as well put together. Maybe structured. It's a much more unstructured format. But we talked about it a lot. And one of the things we did as we started doing the show is we sat down and we really tried to understand if we put all that stuff we talked about over the years and years that we'd been talking about it into a concept. What does it boil down to? And we were really kind of, again, probably in a ride back and forth, we were talking about it, and it came down to 3 items which made up this whole concept of survival chi. And it boiled down to the first thing we were talking about was community. And that kind of goes to that companionship to some extent and security. But it's the idea of being part of something, having friends, having companions through this. Because honestly, if you're a lone ranger, it just doesn't work very well.
Well, even he had Tonto.
It's difficult to become the everything to everyone, or even to yourself. So that community was really the first piece of it.
And going back to something we said in the very beginning of the show, the larger the survival community and preparedness community, depending on how you want to label yourself, becomes, the more prepared we are as a whole community, and the more secure we become.
Right.
In a very voluntary sense.
Oh yeah, completely.
Yes.
Well, and then we took that and we started going into, okay, so now I'm part of this community, and what do I need? Well, the first thing I need to do is be a good individual contributor to that community. And in order to do that, I need to have my health. And that boils into 2 things. First one is physical health. I need to maintain physical health. And, both of us have gone through periods of working out more, working out less, gaining weight, losing weight, all that stuff. We're normal people. Sometimes we just get busy and things get out of control. But at the end of the day, we're both pretty healthy people. We're physically fit. We try to stay that way. But even just down to understanding, your own allergies, your own limitations, that kind of goes to the physical health idea. And then we said, well, what else do you need? Because physical health just isn't enough. And you need mental health. And actually, the community helps contribute to that mental health. But you need to maintain a mental health. You need to know yourself. You need to understand yourself, know what makes you tick. And that was a really, really important part of this. And we talked about that one a lot until it really became clear that it had to be part of this whole survival philosophy. So now it's community, health, and the last one, and this is probably the most complicated of all of them, intelligence. And that really boiled into a few areas, but intelligence is everything that relates to your ability to do things, to learn things, to understand things. It's skills. We push skills all the time in the show, going out and learning new things. I finally took up the archery that I put in my survival chi plan, and I'm loving every minute of it. And really trying to learn how to do it and be as good at it as I can get. It's going to take a long time. I've only recently started, but already starting to understand how it works, what makes it work, and getting myself to go and just do it, making the time to learn.
And going past skills, or expanding on skills, is there are a lot of different skills when it comes to survival. And a lot of them are very enjoyable to most of us. Some skills don't have an interest in, and that's where community comes in, and that you cannot be a lone wolf, and so you cannot be everything all of the time. So we are dependent on one another, but we build on our skills, and that can mean learning other languages. That can mean archery, as John was talking about, or firearms, as we were talking about a minute ago, of what we were doing when we started coming up with these concepts.
Or even proper knife work, Aaron. I know you've been focused on that a lot lately.
Yeah. I've been working a lot with called the Moore's Kochansky tri-stick, and it's if I remember correctly, it's about a dozen different kinds of bushcraft notches that you put into one stick to practice them. And one of the things I was learning during doing that, to give an example of skills and kind of the perspective that you gain through them, which is another part of intelligence, is I really, really learned how to work a new knife and the nuances and idiosyncrasies and personality of this new knife that I had. And so I got to learn it. And aside from just learning these bushcraft notches and making a mess on my deck and driving my girlfriend crazy, but which is a skill I excel at quite well, but both making a mess and driving my girlfriend nuts. But so that's why skills really fit in there, and they're a chance to expand, and they're a chance to gain new perspectives, and there's always hidden value in them. And the same thing with history. As we move on to another component of the intelligence part of survival chi is history, knowing your personal history. The old cliche, you can't know where you're going if you don't know where you've been. And that applies from a personal level, from a regional level to a national level, cultural levels. You have to kind of know what is the essence of something. Where did it begin? What is and why is that important? And then from there we can kind of go, all right, I can kind of see a path going forward. And so, about like I was alluding to, history is not just picking up the textbook and learning Texas history or Oklahoma history or English history or Scottish history or wherever we are. It's also, what is your personal history? What is your family of origin? And from there, we can go back to physical health and mental health in some cases of what is my health history? What things do I need to be aware of and looking out for? Go past that, we get into something that we kind of started getting into more in the show, which is talking about perspectives and asking those deeper philosophical questions about survival and our lives in general. And so that's kind of why you'll notice the show sometimes will get rather deep about some topics. Because if all we're ever doing is just kind of glancing across the surface, we're missing all the really interesting and deep stuff that can take us into different directions if we're not looking at the really deep stuff. And it's why we also often ask questions rather than just giving these one-way answers. And often why we don't come on the show and say, this is the way, this is the only way. We may do that once in a while, but that's very rare. Very rare. Because it's, as we talked about earlier in the show, it's contextual. It is different for each person. What survival means can be different for each person. What level of survival, what does that really mean? And that is different for each person. So we have to ask these deeper questions and not get frustrated by them and keep going with them. And so, but to kind of go past survival chi, we've talked in the past, and as far as new preppers go, that this is one of the questions we get a lot of, going back to skills, is where do I start? And we had this real problem when we got started, which is where do we start picking up skills?
I mean, we had a few shows that we knew were out there. We couldn't necessarily get past the emotional aspect of the shows. And very rarely were they aimed at somebody coming into it new. So they were talking about these big, grand concepts, usually starting with, first thing you need to do is move to a farm in the middle of nowhere. And then it's like, okay, so we're not going to do that. And usually, I mean, at least speaking for me, that was usually the end of me listening to that particular podcast or that particular blog or whatever it might be. So it was very difficult to find a good place to start.
And that's when we started picking up, kind of making our own way with things. And so we started doing things like going to Red Cross And I know there's other first aid and CPR organizations out there, but the one that we picked, because it was the one that we knew, was to go to the Red Cross.
And going back to, if you're starting out new, it's the easiest one. Name recognition, you can easily find them pretty much anywhere. So that was just a simple one, Red Cross, CPR. That's a great place to start.
And it's usually, if you want to take the full-blown adult, teen, and infant CPR first aid class, it's like one all-day Saturday class.
Yeah, I think so.
And actually, they're fun to go to, and they're interesting. So, and another one we found through reading the book, Neil Strauss's book, Emergency, was a program called CERT. To the best of our knowledge, we also have started to gain quite a large international crowd. CERT is, as far as we know, that it's only an American thing.
There may be something similar in other
look
countries.
in your
I know in the UK there is a community response group that's part of their version of FEMA. I don't know all the names and acronyms that are used there, but a lot of places do have something similar. We found CERT. Oh, and by the way, even in the US, as we found through many of you, CERT is not available in every location. So if it is available in your location, definitely try to take it, because we found it to be extremely useful, not necessarily from a learning skills perspective, but from a general community knowledge and understanding perspective. What is the role of FEMA? What is the role of a first responder? What is your role in a natural disaster? What are the expectations that the first responders in FEMA have of you as the individual? Which, surprisingly enough, most of us don't know. And that's not, by the way, that I don't blame all of us for that. I don't think FEMA and the first responders are quite vocal enough about what our responsibilities are in this particular case.
And what their responsibilities
I think a lot of people tend to put so much reliance on them being out there because they are there, that we forget that we also have a role and responsibility in a disaster.
There's also, most community colleges have some kind of EMT program if you want to go beyond CERT and beyond Red Cross, that's actually, we have a friend that's been on the show a few times, Ron Davis of EMS Newbie Podcast, and that's how he got into becoming, I mean, he's a paramedic now, but that's how he got into it. It was actually the book 1 second after he read that and was realized, hey, I have no real useful survival skills. I need to, if something really went wrong. And he went down the rabbit hole, so to speak, to the point of becoming a paramedic.
Yeah, and by the way, to put it in perspective, Ron didn't start out with some crazy survival adventurous background or anything else. He started out as a developer, software developer. I don't know if that's where he started, but prior to being an EMT, he was doing software development. He's a photographer. He's not the crazy safari adventure guy or anything like that.
Although he kind of is now.
Well, he is now, but he didn't start out that way.
No. And there's also what we've seen through the community, through the forum, and through just contact in general, is the concept of becoming a volunteer, which also goes back to community. Volunteering in your local fire department. And there's all kinds of resources and training available there.
And many of you know a Jeep. Well, Jeep is he's a volunteer firefighter, and one of our avid listeners. He's also forum moderator, so he's doing that. And again, it's something more of us should be doing to expand our knowledge base.
And there's also, in some areas, there's volunteer search and rescue, where there's a lot that can be learned in a variety of different things. That these are all skills that you can apply to yourself, apply to your family, and in disaster times, be a help rather than a hindrance in your community. And you can go out from there. There's all kinds of wilderness survival classes, all kinds of medical wilderness classes. There's all kinds of things out there doing a little bit of research. And also, of course, the forum is a really great resource for that, because people are constantly gathering information and pouring it into the forum. That's the part of the sales pitch for the forum today. You're not on it.
And if, I'll do the other sales pitch. If you are someone out there who either teaches a skill, has a skill that's central to survival, or something like that, let us know. And there's always the potential that you can be on the show.
We talked about the more philosophical parts of the show, and that we like to ask questions. And so I'm going to kind of start wrapping up the show today with since this is if you're new to the show and new to prep, a question that comes up, and I hear it often, and not from people that I don't think highly of in the community, but you do hear that urban survival is an oxymoron. And that is, the answer to that is yes or no, because it depends on context. It depends on what we're talking about. What kind of disaster are we talking about? What do we consider survival? If we want to take it to the completely absurd, and Jonathan and I were actually laughing about this just going over the show notes before the show, if you want to take it to the absolute absurd, survival itself is an oxymoron. Because guess what? None of us make it out of this life alive.
Oh, come on.
I'm sorry you're not immortal, John.
Hey.
I tried making a deal, with low places, but I could not get immortality.
Days I'll get there. Yeah, it's that whole no one gets out alive idea. And it goes back to some of the stupid things you read. Like, I just read an article recently that sitting at work increases your odds of dying. Now, they didn't put any more context around that. Like, not dying early, not taking X amount of time off your life. No, it increases your odds of dying. And I was joking around with Aaron before the show that, well, my odds of dying prior to reading that were 100% at some point. I guess now it's 105 or something like that. I don't know. So I'm not sure I'm too worried about that. But yes, it can be taken to that absurd level. It can even, but that whole point of putting it into context is good. And I think one of the things we heard that was very interesting was during our CERT class, actually. And we've mentioned this a few times, but I'll do it again because I thought it was great. The Homeland Security guy who spoke at our CERT class was asked a question by somebody in the class. Well, what happens if a nuclear missile is sent to Houston? And the guy's response was great. Not that, oh, you should be living in the woods or anything like that. That's Dallas's problem. And his point was made even more clear when he talked about the radius for an attack like that, if there really were an all-scale nuclear missile sent to Houston. If that happened, then it wouldn't just be Houston taken off the map, but it would be all the rural areas around Houston taken off the map. Places like Conroe, places like Tomball. Those are all the little towns that are relatively more rural. They go past suburban and towards rural. So it's not just the urban areas that would be taken out by that. It's how far do you really want to be from an urban area? And by the way, the further you go out, the more difficult survival becomes as well, because you have to fend more for yourself. So it's all about being able to survive what? What is it that you want to survive? And again, going to the context, if the issue is surviving a hurricane, well, Aaron and I can both speak very authoritatively on living in an urban environment does not hinder your ability to survive a hurricane.
Not one bit.
We've both done it. We've survived some pretty significant ones. Now, we are not stupid. We don't stay in the eye of a storm. We didn't drive towards Galveston when the hurricane came. We followed the instructions. We did what we had to. We stored water. And at the end of the day, we both made it through some pretty significant storms in our lifetimes.
But that is the real key question. What is it that we're trying to survive? And that's always my question when I hear urban survival is an oxymoron. Which is, okay, I'm listening. But what is the context? What is it that we're worried about? Sure, if you enjoy rural life, the air is cleaner. Maybe the people are nicer. I don't know. It depends on where you live. I've been
people are pretty nice in Austin. Yeah. I got to tell you.
And for the most part, people are pretty nice in Houston.
That's true, too.
And I've been in small towns where people were just jerks.
I've met people.
There is definitely, maybe people are, in general, a little warmer in small towns, and they tend to know each other a little better, and, well, that can have a bad context, too. Maybe they know too much about your private business, or are too interested in your private business, for that matter. But that is going back to the importance is, what is the context? When we're talking about survival, when we're talking about anything, there has to be context to have a good discussion about things. In an urban environment, in a complete and utter shit hit the fan, does urban survival become an oxymoron? And that's actually where I'm making an assumption here, but I'm assuming that's what people are talking about when they say that. And even that can be debated to some extent. Yes.
Plenty of people survived 9/11 living in New York.
Going even beyond that, there's been urban environments that have had wars, urban
Right.
environments where society has kind of shut down and become almost lawless. And people have still survived in an urban environment. Whether or not they've survived better or worse than a rural environment is debatable. And it also, again, depends on what kind of shit hit the fan are we talking about. Because in Argentina, when they experienced an economic collapse, there's a book by a man that goes by the name of Fairfall, and his entire book was dedicated to talking about survival in the context of an economic collapse in Argentina in that time period, which was a couple decades back. And he made very good points about that there were pros and cons to living in an urban environment, which is where he chose to stay, and there were pros and cons to living in a rural environment that some of them were pretty scary. And he chose to stay in an urban environment and did pretty well, and said, you adjusted. But again,
Right.
it comes down to context. If we're going to say, it comes down to context. That's why it becomes very difficult to say definitively, in a very general sense, what is right and what is wrong, because we don't have context. We don't know what the pieces are. So it depends, is the answer.
The long way to that is, it depends. Well, and I guess, just to add to it with one quick statement, it all just depends on what it is you think you're going to have to survive.
Exactly. And so, we've touched on it a little bit, but why go so deep? Well, if we don't ponder the tough questions, the ones that seemingly have no answers, are we not still sheep? And that's a pretty common name for things and for people in the survival community, that people that are not awake, that are not paying attention, that are just going with the flow are sheep. Even if we are in the preparedness community, in the survival community, and we're awake in our context, if we're just still going along with the simple answers, go here, do this, buy this, store this, eat this, are we not still sheep? So we have to ask these questions. That, we wrap up episode 70. Thank you for joining us today. This has been an episode from the In the Rabbit Hole Urban Survival Podcast. You can learn more by visiting intherabbithole.com. Be sure to like this video and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more great survival stuff.